Still in chapter 1, we're looking this morning at chapter 1, starting in verse 12. But to remind you where we're at, and if you're just stepping in, to give you a little context, Paul's writing this letter out of a Roman prison. He's writing to a church in the Greek city of Philippi, the first church planted on technically European soil, the beginning of the gospel movement that eventually will reach us many, many centuries later. He offers thanks for the partnership. He offers early on in chapter 2 this central hymn to Christ that the entire letter revolves around. In that, throughout the letter, he has this undertone of joy threaded throughout. He encourages them, commands them to pursue humility like Christ as presented in that hymn, to pursue unity together in that gospel partnership with him and each other. He provides himself as an example and some other workers in the ministry that they've encountered, including one from among them, possibly their own pastor, Epaphroditus. And he offers praise for their generosity, noting that in their own suffering and poverty, they have still stepped up to give beyond expectation, to bring the gospel to other people. So we look this morning at Philippians 1, verses 12 through 18. And what I want you to see in this, we'll repeat it a few times, is that suffering for the gospel is about counting gains, not losses. And that is to turn the experience of suffering on its head. I think that typically suffering is not something we think about gaining from. So I'm going to ask that you stand as we read these few verses. It's a reminder to us that this is God's Word. Stand to recognize it's still important, worthy of honor, and it speaks alive to us today. Paul writes to them, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard, to all the rest, that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. You can be seated. So Paul is going to highlight his suffering, but address their potential concerns and show them that some great things are happening. But I want us to start with that idea of suffering, just in general, and then more specifically get to the idea of suffering for the gospel. How many times do you really feel like life is just a rat in a lab, running the maze, hoping that you push the right button and you don't get the buzz, the zap, the loudspeaker, instead you get the food pellet? We just want to figure out which one's going to lead to comfort and abundance and avoid the things that are going to hurt. We may not ourselves at this moment be suffering, but you probably experience some. Some of you have for a very long time. It's just chronic. It doesn't go away. Presented with the choice between suffering and avoided it, what's our natural response? I mean, if you know that lever is going to shock you and that one's going to give you food, which one do you push? Right? None of us generally willingly walk into suffering. But when or why would you? Because there are occasions when someone might. Those of you who work with the fire and rescue are faced with that potential life-threatening situation now, and we have to choose to suffer for a greater good. Any of you who've gone to the hospital for a surgery have undergone temporary suffering for some later hoped-for good. Pain in the meantime for hopefully recovery and strength later. But there are things even greater than our own personal long-term benefit that would lead us to willingly suffer in the short term. When you suffer, though, and sometimes we got to recognize it comes on us whether we choose it or not, when it happens, what can you choose to do about it then? Paul is, of course, in prison. That's his immediate suffering. And the Philippians have heard about this. We'll find out later in the letter that they sent Epaphroditus with a gift their generosity, probably with the news of the church, with questions, and with their concerns. And he is addressing some of that. Right here, he's responding to this potential anxiety, fear, and the possibility that his suffering could be a deterrent. Yeah, it makes you think through this, though. Why is he in prison? What's the purpose of judicial punishment? Why is there a system of courts and laws and prisons and fines and punishments? It's to stop people from harming themselves or others, to stop from doing things that are harmful to society in general, to stop things that are illegal, and, as a secondary effect, to deter others, because if you get arrested for something, well, that'll stop you, but what if your friend gets arrested for something that both of you used to be doing? Maybe you start thinking about changing your life. This is time for a new career, perhaps, or better habits. Well, what are the Philippians thinking? Paul, their church planter, their friend, pastor, father in the faith, is now suffering in a very obvious way, known to all of them. Is that a deterrent to them? Has it stopped the gospel? Is it all, the brakes on? They're wondering. So he responds to this. He tells them that he's been locked up in Rome in the Praetorium. This refers to the military headquarters in Rome and the soldiers that were residing within. These are the personal bodyguard of Caesar, the emperor. At any time in Rome's history, there were 4,000 to 10,000 of them. In Paul's day, probably closer to 4, at least 9 cohorts of almost 500 men. And he tells us, if you're looking at this, he says, I want you to know, as what's happened to me has served to advance the gospel, it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard. And that's interesting. But then when you realize that he's saying, you could take the population of Belfast, imagine all of them in Roman centurion uniforms, and then imagine Paul talking to them one by one. In fact, you could imagine Paul chained to them for a day, in which he had nothing else to do but talk about the Lord he loved. He says that in his time there, as they've cycled guards in and around, and those guards have gone back to the barracks and talked about the day they spent with that guy, that the gospel has spread through the entire royal guardhouse. At some points in Rome's history, these were just ceremonial. Earlier on, possibly still in Paul's time, these could have been like SEAL Team 6. It's like the elites. These are veterans from Roman campaigns. They journeyed for months up into the Germanic areas, fought these crazy barbarian tribes where guys come out of the woods with antlers and paint on, screaming, blood-curdling cries, and they're back here, chained to Paul, listening to the gospel. That's crazy, but amazing. He's in this custody under their direct supervision, and you can imagine, it's rough and tumble. They don't put up with anything. What are the Philippians going to think? What's Paul going to think? Has this put a stop to it? Well, he says no. Prison punishment, it's meant to stop the gospel. Calvin, writing on this, says, you can imagine that the devil thought, and the wicked opponents Paul has around him, thought that this would put a stop to it. But just the opposite. It instead led to greater fame for the gospel. It made it known in a hard and almost impossible to imagine location. Now, in 2 Timothy, he says something, another time when he is in prison, because this happens a few times. He says, I'm suffering, bound with chains like a criminal, but the word of God is not bound. I couldn't think of a better summary of the situation he's in. He's chained to a Roman guard, but the gospel isn't. It's going from guard to guard to guard and beyond that. This is amazing. A little later in the book, the last chapter, he's going to tell them, all the saints greet you. This is the letter going back to the church, and kindling their unity together. They all have faith in the same Savior. And part of this body of believers greeting them, he says, belong to Caesar's household. So some of Caesar's servants, some of Caesar's family, they've heard the gospel. Not only have they heard the gospel, but they had ready ears. God had prepared them. He regenerated hearts, and they turned in faith because Paul was in prison. The gospel made it into the house of the emperor of the Roman Empire because Paul was in chains. This prison served to advance the gospel. That's what he's getting at when he says, I want you to know this has served to advance the gospel. It's brought it where he would have never had access otherwise. I mean, can you imagine Paul showing up in Rome without chains, knocking on the door to Caesar's palace? Probably not going to get an audience. But they couldn't avoid listening to him when they had him stuck to their ankle or their wrist all day long. So amazing things have happened out of this. And what you find is suffering for the gospel wasn't about counting losses, but counting gains. He doesn't sit in prison bemoaning how difficult it is, because it was. You know, it's not an easy ride. And I'm sure that he wasn't given a willing ear, and that just as much as he tried to talk to them, they probably insulted and joked back. I mean, we've seen how they reacted to Jesus when he was handed over to the Roman guards in Jerusalem. They can be brutal. It was part of the expectation of their position and their culture. You know, they were a violent set of warriors. And yet, he instead talks about the opportunities this has created, the amazing steps forged forward for the gospel that you couldn't have expected any other way. But he goes on and he says, prison didn't just stop him from preaching the gospel as he had a personal success, right? He got to keep preaching the gospel. He got to see the gospel move through those places. But it also didn't deter others from preaching. So he says there's more than just one gain. In fact, he goes on to explain that there's been gain throughout the believing community of Rome, and the whole point of the letter is to show the Philippians that his imprisonment is actually a gain for them too, and that their awareness of it and their participation in it is for their good, their encouragement, and the furtherance of the gospel even there. So he says, it didn't deter them. He says, most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So he got to push the gospel forward, and others took advantage of it as well. This is interesting, though. I mean, this entire passage, if you don't just read it through superficially quickly, is curious, because you don't expect these kind of things. It should be kind of surprising if we stop and think. His imprisonment, somehow, it inspired confidence. Confidence from imprisonment. That should make you ask some questions. How does imprisonment inspire confidence instead of deterrent? Why would that encourage them instead of make them more cautious, anxious, and quiet? Why would they look at that and not think, boy, if that happened to Paul, what could happen to me? Well, he says, it's not really his imprisonment alone. If you look at that, the details are always important. He says that, and this is verse 14, most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. He's saying the confidence is actually in the Lord. The imprisonment was just the situation that made it visible. There he is. What is the situation? It's dire, it's dangerous, it's terrible, and yet what are they hearing from him? His love for them. And we just saw this prayer where he prays for their love to abound after telling them how much he loves them and cares for them. They see him in prison, and yet they don't see him broken by that, beaten by that, worried by that. They see in him an unnatural attitude. There's no explanation for that except for the presence of Christ in his life, the power of the Spirit. They're seeing a man who should be broken and beaten, instead victorious. I mean, sure, he's still in chains, but those chains haven't accomplished a bit of what they were intended and designed to do. In fact, just the opposite has happened. They look at that and they see Christ triumphing over the efforts of a state opposed to the gospel and to the church, of the spiritual powers in the world behind that are trying to push this down, to choke it out. Heather and I talked about this week, and she said it's similar in effect to what happened at the cross. You know, the powers of the nations came to be both pointed at and against Christ there. The Jewish nation, the Romans, Jews and Gentiles both decided that they would put an end to this. And we know behind that, from some of those glimpses behind the scenes we get with Peter's temptation, that there's more than just the physical, political issues going on. That the heart of all of this is a spiritual war. And in that moment, it appears, as everything is darkened and the Son of God is dead, that evil's won. And yet, in evil's greatest act against God, biggest, largest, lost my word. Anyway, just an act of pure malevolence. And he instead comes out of that and saves the world, conquers death when death was given to him, conquers sin, buries it, leaves it behind. That is what the gospel is like. That is what God is like. And so Paul knows that. That's why this doesn't surprise him, and he's trying to show another example of that to these believers. They've heard the gospel, they know how death was triumphed over, how sin was beaten, how Satan was stripped of his power, his venom, his teeth removed, how he's now no longer able to have the same kind of threat and power over people that he once did. He is, in some effect, bound. Here, the same. They can have confidence in the Lord, looking at possible imprisonment, other forms of suffering, and know that just like in Jesus' life, and just like in Paul's, the Lord has power over that. And in fact, not just power to deal with it, but to use it for good. And I know you've heard me say that over and over. It's just that is the thing for me that sticks the most. It gives me, I think, the most awe, is that he can take purely intended acts of evil and accomplish the greatest good out of them. And I don't know anything else, and I can't imagine anything or one else that's able to do that. So what does Paul's imprisonment inspire? Or who? We're told most of the brothers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but I want you to know he doesn't say most of the elders. He doesn't say most of the evangelists. He says most of the brothers. He's talking about the general believing population of Rome. They saw him in prison. And these are the farmhands, the slaves, the people who belong to this church, who have varied backgrounds, but nothing extra special about them except the presence of Christ in them. Not unlike the video we saw, people who have suffered, people who may have no education, maybe little to no literacy, have no prospects of poverty, diabetes, whatever it might be on top of the situation they're in, and yet the gospel came to them, and like you heard, they were excited to start bringing that to other camps. These people are excited to start bringing that to other Romans. What does his imprisonment inspire? Bold witness. And isn't that just the opposite of what you'd expect? He's in prison for doing that, and they say, boy, I want to do that too. But he does note that there are mixed motives within this. In fact, there's even the potential for greater suffering for him. He says there are some preaching out of goodwill. They have a love for Paul, they have a love for the gospel, a love for the kingdom, and they want to see that go forward. They know Paul has been appointed as an apostle. They've seen evidence of that divine commission, and they want to support that. They know he's there to defend the gospel, to argue its benefits against its detractors. They want to see it succeed, not just in the royal courthouse and the guardhouse, but in all of Rome. But then there's another side of this, a negative side. He says there are others that are preaching to add to his suffering. Now, it is a bit of a head-scratcher. He tells us that they go out preaching the gospel, and their motive is to make Paul suffer more. And it doesn't seem all that logical. I think there might be a couple of possibilities. These are just guesses, because he doesn't tell us how, but we do have to know, of course, he did tell us most of the brothers, and then he says some. He didn't actually say these aren't believers. The last people he were talking about, he called brothers. So these may, and I think possibly were, members of the church, believers who, for whatever reason, didn't see eye to eye with Paul. Now, some of them may have been just wrong all the way to the heart. Maybe they weren't believers at all. But the way he portrays this, some of these were probably believers, but there was some kind of, he says, rivalry and ambition. And I don't know if that's just because they knew Paul's history. This persecutor of the church maybe hadn't been able to get over that, forgive him, and thought, you know what, finally he's getting what he deserves. Maybe they just looked at that and saw him as the face of the movement. And he says there's an ambition, there's a selfish ambition. Now, ambition is about wanting to get something for ourselves and wanting to make much of ourselves. Maybe they were jealous. They saw Paul in the limelight, and they wanted some of that for themselves. Maybe they thought they could do it better. I mean, don't we all have some times when we struggle like that with other people? We might be in a group in the community. I think we can do that particular thing better. But it happens in the church too. We see some other church perhaps succeeding, and we become jealous. Why are they growing and we're not? Or why are they doing that and God doesn't give, we do the same thing and God doesn't bless that? This personal ambition is a part of it. How that's played out, we don't really know. It's just left us to speculate. But for whatever reason, they want Paul to have greater pressure on him. They want him to be harassed more. They don't want him to be freed. I mean, they're out to get him. And the weapon they're using is the preaching of the gospel. It's a little bit strange. And again, we're just guessing about how that would have worked out. I could see two ways possibly, and maybe you could see your own. He is the ringleader. So if people preach the gospel, guess who's probably going to get in more trouble? I mean, if you want to stop a movement, what do? Get rid of the head. Cut off the head and the voice. Make an example of them and frighten the rest of the sheep. Well, the more sheep there are, the more pressure on that shepherd. So maybe they're hoping that that's going to come back on, more attention thrown to Paul, and so they can do what they want. They can build their own little kingdom within the church, and he's going to take all of the brunt of that. Or perhaps they want to show the gospel's foolishness. Some of them might be unbelievers. They really don't want the gospel to succeed. Why are they proclaiming it? Because when they hear it, it just sounds dumb. We see evidence of that. There's graffiti from the old Roman Empire of a donkey-headed man hanging on a cross. And next to that it says, Aristarchus worships his god, as if he's bowing down to a donkey. Maybe they would have used a little bit less polite language about that too. The point is, they were proclaiming the gospel. They put it right there on the side of the train or whatever it was. They're just graffiti. It's true. The crucifixion, for all to see. They're proclaiming truth. But why are they doing it? To make fun of the one who believes it. Because does it make sense that God would die? Does it make sense that you can be forgiven for nothing without having to earn your way back into? I mean, in a society where it's all about performing the right rituals and offering the right sacrifices to please the capricious gods who one day may bless you and one day may curse you just because they're in a bad mood, the God of the Bible is very foreign to the Greek and Roman pantheons. They would just lay this out, and Paul even says that. To the Greeks, it's foolishness. They could proclaim that, and I think that you find that kind of thing happen today. In the cultural movements against an older biblical morality, sometimes they don't actually lie about what believers believe. They put it right out there because the cultural norm, the pendulum has shifted so much that hearing what the Bible proclaims as truth just sounds like something out of tune. It's like listening to a piano that's been left in a cold and wet environment, and you hit the keys and nothing sounds melodious. They hear the truth of the Bible and it just makes them angrier. In the gender and sexuality issues of the day, it's very common for people to actually proclaim, the truth of the Bible, but to do so expecting full well that it will be heard as a statement of bigotry. The only reason they're saying it is just to actually make people angrier about what the Bible truly says. So it's possible that there is preaching going on here for the motive of just jest, laughter, getting people to joke, or to rise up in anger against these falsehoods. The early Christians were looked at as a danger to the empire, theologically, because the Greeks and the Romans, they're spiritual people. They believe in the gods, and they believe that these upstarts are upsetting all the gods. The Roman Empire is not as big as it once was. Its glory days are in the BC era, not the AD anymore. And why is that? Well, very often it's pinned on the Christians. They've rejected the gods. They're atheists who don't worship Zeus, Mars, etc. So I think that possibly they were showing the gospel's foolishness as a way to bring greater trouble on Paul. The more the people heard about it, the more angry they were, the louder they would call for his punishment. Regardless, in the end, Paul's rejoicing. For two reasons. One, for the gospel to be preached because of love. Okay, we have no problem there, makes sense. But surprisingly, he's also rejoicing for the gospel to be preached for wrong motive. And that just sounds wrong, right? I underlined, though, the same phrase in both, because that's what he's really rejoicing about. The rest of it's important, but not as important to him as that. The gospel is being preached. Piper says, in summary, Paul's celebration of gospel truth overrides his sorrow at defective motives. We don't have to disbelieve that Paul was unhappy about their motives. Would he have rather they were not hypocrites? Sure. But when it came down to it, people were hearing about Jesus, his death, resurrection, and ascension, the offer of the forgiveness of sin, and the welcome into the kingdom as heirs, and he was rejoicing about that. So in a way, any publicity is good publicity, right? I mean, we won't be long before we're back in the political season again. It's already spinning up a little bit. And isn't that the mantra? Any publicity is good publicity. I mean, you can say things that are terrible, but the fact that people are thinking about you and you get name recognition in the long run might be worth it. Well, sometimes I think that's the case, and that might be a bit of what Paul's getting into here. There's a scene I find quite humorous. Stephen Colbert, now he is a progressive Catholic, Comedy Central, he's now the Late Show host, I think. And he has people on all the time, and he roasts them. And sometimes you don't really, you wouldn't believe what he's saying, but he plays the part of a conservative news host. He himself is not. He's a satirist, so he makes fun of conservatives pretty often. But he gets Bart Ehrman on here. Ehrman is a doctor, an academic doctor, down in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who once was a believing Christian, now a very vocal agnostic. He's not willing to say there's no God, but he's not willing to say there is. And he's very, very convinced that the Jesus of the Bible that we know today is not the real Jesus, that there's been a whole lot of shenanigans and just deceit from the church over the days. And in this particular, he's highlighting a new book, Jesus Interrupted, where he's trying to argue that the church made up Jesus hundreds of years after. I mean, not that he didn't exist, but they made up his teachings that were never really his. So Ehrman gets into this, and Colbert brings up a point. And Ehrman says, well, Jesus does get called the Son of God, but he says that doesn't mean Jesus is God, because Solomon's called Son of God. So, I mean, there's some truth to that. You have to take things in context. Colbert says, well, okay, just a minute. What's the son of a duck? Now, to be fair, I don't think that Colbert's argument is very strong, very powerful, or that it deals very fairly with Ehrman's claims. However, it is humorous, and there's in this a highlight of the gospel. So Colbert asks, what's the son of a duck? And of course, what's the answer? Duck. So what's he implying? What's the Son of God? Like begets like, begats like. Like will birth like. Well, he goes on, because he says, well, it's different. Just because it's the Son of God doesn't mean it. Well, he says, okay, well, what if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, and it raises the dead like a duck? Then it really is a funny bit. If you want a good laugh, I'd encourage you. Ehrman, I'm surprised he holds his cool, because Colbert is just merciless. But in the end, neither one of them are really on the side we're on. And yet, in this, what happens? There is a highlight where, in the course of the conversation, the deity of Christ is affirmed. I mean, he's a satirist, and he's actually, he's a Catholic. He does believe in the deity of Christ, but he doesn't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. There are hints in there where you can tell he's playing this up, but really making fun of conservative evangelicals in it a bit. Yet he talks about some true core tenets of the gospel that we would share, that he would find in ancient Catholic things and like the Apostles' Creed. The point of this is, there is some good publicity there, against both of their intentions. The gospel was heard on national television, portions of it, and you can go look at the internet, and some people got the satirism, and some people it just went over their head, and they're celebrating Colbert as a defender of the faith. Even though they're wrong there, they still got excited about the gospel. And so in like manner, I think Paul would say, sure, it could be better, but man, people heard about the resurrection. They heard about the divinity of Christ. But we still need to keep our thinking caps on, be critical, because what about the prosperity gospel? teaching that God wants you to be healthy, wealthy, wise, and you can have it all with enough faith. He talks about faith, he talks about God. I mean, those are the right words, aren't they? But faith in what? Where is sin in that? Usually it's not mentioned. Why did Christ die? That's often pretty hard to fit in there and explain. The question has to be, in any of these cases, and you could put up any other kind of presentation of a gospel. You could talk about different cults in our present day. And then in the end you ask them, what is this the gospel? The gospel, not a gospel. And that's what's important to Paul. Any publicity good publicity? Maybe. If the gospel is declared without doctrinal corruption. If the truths at the core of who Jesus is and what he's done are presented, whether from ill motive or not, whether to make fun of Christians or not, if people actually hear it, you know what? Some people listening to that might just laugh it off. But some people listening to that might notice. They might know that other people are laughing at it, but hear that and hear it for the truth it really is. Because that's how it works. It comes to some, we're told, like an aroma of death. It just isn't pleasing. It's not what they want. It's because their hearts are hard. They're not prepared. God isn't at work in that place. But others are going to hear the same message that was laughed off, rejected, a nose turned away at, and they're going to say, that's the news I was waiting for. So the point is, an impure gospel can't be celebrated. And you see Paul in Galatians. He says, if we or an angel from heaven preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach, let him be accursed. So if these opponents of his in Rome were preaching a different gospel, he would not have told the Philippians that I'm rejoicing in this. Evidently, this gospel presentation, even for impure motive, is pure in its truth content. The heart behind it is hypocritical. But he's celebrating the fact that, nonetheless, the gospel is moving forward. Suffering for the gospel is about counting gains, not losses. He's counting that as a gain because the gospel's going forward. His imprisonment has caused some to step up with love and support for him and proclaim the gospel. His imprisonment has caused some to step up and try to make it worse for him by proclaiming the gospel. And that might sound weird, but they're proclaiming the gospel nonetheless, and he's happy that no matter what caused that, that itself is praiseworthy, worthwhile, and celebrated. Christ is proclaimed, he says, and I rejoice, whether for truth or for pretense, whether for right motive or wrong. So then we ask, what can we learn from this? I think first, it's possible to serve for the wrong motive. To step back and not just look at that as an other, but a potentially us. We could be like that, especially as it seems some of them were believers. They're counted among the brothers, yet they're working with a selfish ambition in the moment. That can come on any of us. Selfish ambition creep up in us, use the gospel, our church connections for our own gain. We can be working in God's kingdom and still try to carve a place for our own kingdom. We also need to know that it's easy to get jealous. If other people are being used by God, I mean, don't we want to be? And that's not wrong. But if we start to dislike them and to wish ill on them, and even to wish for them to fail so that we're not so jealous or that we would succeed instead, then we've crossed into sin. And that can creep up in our hearts so easily too. Missionaries deal with that just like anyone else. You go on the field, church planners, pastors. You know, how easy is it for one to compare their ministry to another? But it can go down to a Sunday school class. More people want to come to your Sunday school class than my Sunday school class. You know, it can creep in at any level, any time. We may suffer for the gospel and others not. I mean, you think about that. Paul suffered. Others proclaimed the same message and they didn't. He didn't get upset about that. He didn't get jealous about that. He recognized that that was still part of God's plan and useful in God's plan. It led to fruit as well. Just the fact that suffering existed wasn't a negative mark. It wasn't a judgment of God on him. In the end, what it really boils down to is that we have to love the gospel more than self and see the success of the gospel as our success. What was happening with his opponents is that they weren't seeing the success of the gospel as their success. They were seeing that as Paul's success. They wanted some of their own. Now, that's the whole point of the ambition. But gospel ambition isn't wrong. To be ambitious not for self, but for the kingdom. To be ambitious for the gospel, that we would want it to grow in its fame and its honor and its impact. That's worthwhile and worthy. That's right. That's what Paul's all about. He's in prison. You could imagine him not wanting to be there, not wanting instead to have the freedom that these others have, but he's not stuck on that. He's just happy, and he's celebrating this success outside and inside the suffering of jail. So, suffering and learning, back to the rat, where we started, the big picture. Suffering for the gospel specifically, and then our response. If the rat pushing the lever gets a shock, what next? Generally, they stop pushing that lever, right? If they push the other lever, the button, and they get food, well, they learn. And usually it doesn't take long. Rats are surprisingly smart about that kind of thing. And in some ways, we're not all that different. We get burned once, and that might be enough. Sometimes that whole fool me twice thing, but it shouldn't happen a third time. Only takes 2 shots. So if we suffer for an action, we learn that's not a good idea. We'll do something else. We'll avoid that. But what we're seeing Paul show is that doesn't work, and that's no longer the right way to approach things in God's world. Even when we're not suffering, though, and that's where the Philippians are. So now we're connected more to where we're at. None of us are in prison with the gospel, so we can't connect to Paul. We can't feel like Paul's doing. We can't do what Paul's doing in this moment. Maybe someday, some can. But here, we're more the Philippians, the Roman believers. Paul's in prison, and present day, there are believers in prison. There are people suffering persecution. One of the days of the videos, if we get around to watching it or you watch it on your own, is East Asia, and they don't show the face of the missionary working there because he could get in trouble, and the believers there could get in trouble. They choose to follow Christ despite the fact that it may lead to suffering. So I want us to think, we're not in that situation, but there's the potential for it. We could find ourselves in suffering. So where the Philippians are. We have the gospel before us, we have the call to proclaim it, and we're looking at that and the possibilities. We know that it can bring detriment and danger. Then what do we think about? I think for most of us the temptation is that we think about the possibility of suffering, and our mind zeroes in and camps on what can we lose? What might I give up? What might this cost me? And we get stuck there. And so we don't do anything about it. We decide that, we really want to share the gospel, but we might lose the job that lets us live here, and then we lose the opportunity of sharing the gospel. Or we have a friendship we're building, we want to share the gospel with them, but we're afraid if we share the gospel, then we'll lose the friendship. So we don't share the gospel so that we can share the gospel in this wrongly circular argument that never gets to the gospel, because we're thinking about the losses. When Paul this whole time is saying we need to reorient the checklist. We don't check off the cons, we look at what gains come out of this. Paul showed there's gain through suffering, and we can bullet point this off. His suffering brought the gospel into a hard place, a place it never would have been otherwise. That might be exactly what it takes and why God uses suffering in your own life at some point. His suffering brought confidence in Christ. You think about this. It's one thing to be confident in something when you never put it to the test, right? But what's he doing? And why are the people encouraged? They're seeing Paul's faith on the line put to the test. The very experience of prison is a proving ground. He there is tempted to a greater degree than he would have been without it to give up on this. And instead they see victory. His suffering, of course, also spurred on gospel witness. Not just in his own immediate situation with people he had contact with, but he knew others were doing it too. That buoyed him up, that encouraged him. So even if our suffering, and then lastly, some suffering comes indirectly. So far we've really been majoring on suffering that comes from the gospel. You intentionally talk about Jesus in the places and to people who don't want it, and that has a cost. But sometimes you just suffer. Your body breaks down, the world is broken, sin exists, people treat you wrongly, and you're in the dumps with maybe very little of your own involvement in that. It's not a consequence for an immediate decision of yours, it's just the consequence of a sinful world bearing down on you. Well, then what? It's not what this passage is all about, but I still think that you can say there's something to learn here. In the end, Paul is confident in that place of suffering. Whether because of his own sharing the gospel, because of others, in that place he can rejoice. And some of the things he's rejoicing in aren't him. They aren't even his situation. He looks outside. He looks at what Christ is doing in other places and finds joy in that. So he can look out of his immediate suffering and in some ways mute that and get his eyes up higher, not stuck down in the immediate, by reminding himself of all the good that's going on outside of where he's at. There's gospel good happening, but he's also hearing good just outside and around. Knowing the goodness that's been found in Christ and the good things going on in the kingdom can be a medicine in the short term for the suffering that you're just going to deal with in the world as it is. But what he's doing and talking about is something that I would encourage you to intentionally take advantage of. And I put this up here as one example. Fox's Book of Martyrs, you can get this free PDF online. You can buy your copy if you like physical books. Then there's other stories, The Insanity of God. There was a book published in 2000-ish about some of the martyrs that we've had in our own denomination serving overseas, whose lives were taken. Actually, the subtitle is Lives Given, Not Taken, in service to the gospel. But the point is, just like Paul was an encouragement to them, other people's stories are often an encouragement to us. And we, I think, are in need of that, to remind ourselves of how good Jesus is by hearing about that and seeing it put to the test in others' lives. I mean, a large part of what's going on here is that people seeing Paul suffering and rejoicing, they learn how valuable Christ is and how little value the things he lost were. You can see that in some of these. Faustinians and Jovita, brothers, early Rome, they are tried and put to torture and eventually death for their faith. Calicerius is not a believer, at least initially, but their steadfastness leads him to cry out, "Great is the God of the Christians," just overcome with their witness in that duress, which then led to his immediate arrest, torture, and death himself. Polycarp, old gentleman in the church, had worked for years and years, lived through some of the times of peace, because persecution wasn't constant, it flared up here and there, but eventually it came after him. And it's an interesting story. He has a relationship with some Christians who are still in Caesar's household, you could say. Some members of the guard know, and they keep slipping him the word, you know what, they're going to try to catch you tonight, you should get out of town. And so for years, Polycarp kind of gets this mystique. Like he has a crystal ball, and whenever they go to show up and get him, they know he was there yesterday or he was there just hours ago and he's gone. He's just got this impeccable timing. Well, finally, after years of this, Polycarp gets convicted about running for the faith. He's older in age, and he just feels led in that moment to stand for the gospel before the watching church. And he waits. Even though he was warned, told to get out, encouraged by friends, he stays home. He's in this Christian's house. The guards show up, and he invites them in for supper. He asks for an hour to go into a back room and to pray. And, they're there, where's he going to go? And he's old, so I guess he gets some respect. And they say, sure. And then he follows them willingly back to eventually his own death. But on the way there, they and the judge try to convince him that it's not really, you're old. This is going to be hard. Why don't you just live out the last couple of years? All you have to do is burn a little incense and say, Caesar is God. That was the test. A little sacrifice to Caesar, just something in a candle fire. Well, what he says is, 86 years I served him. It's a good long life back then. And he never once wronged me. How then shall I blaspheme my King who has saved me? Paul had said that his imprisonment brought him confidence in Christ. That's what he's saying, is I have every reason to be confident in Christ. I've seen him support me through my life. And how could I treat him now with contempt to turn my back? Perpetua, another amazing story. She and Felicitas, two ladies, both married, convicted, caught being professing believers. She's pregnant. She gives birth while in prison after several weeks or months there, and has a newborn. So, just like with Polycarp, they are pressuring her to just burn the incense. Hail to Caesar, Caesar is God, and you can go home. And she says, no. It's hard to think about this. She hands her newborn over to other Christians who, for some reason, are not being put on trial. It was very hit or miss, kind of random lots at sometimes. Wishes them well, despite family and friends calling her to think about the newborn, the baby and all, and goes to the Colosseum. She, Felicitas' mothers, are gored by a bull. She gets back up after having been thrown through the air. She is mauled by a leopard. She's survived both of this with a few others, and finally the bloodthirsty crowd can't be quelled, and so they slew them by the sword. And the point of this is you look at the things they gave up. A nice, easy retirement, end of years, surrounded by the people you've invested your life in. A new life with all of the joys of seeing it walk, talk. What they said is Christ is more valuable than any of those things. They looked at things of life and said, it doesn't compare. And others reading that, and I encourage you to, that's what we're meant to get away, to pull away from that. To read Paul's account, the Philippians, to look at that and to say, you know what, the gospel's worth it. I can talk about that without worrying about the losses. Because, you know, when you see someone willing to count the cost and say it's that valuable, and then you start thinking, you know, what am I going to lose? Is it my newborn? Is it my life? If those things aren't as valuable as work for the kingdom and a relationship with God through Christ, then, I mean, what have we got? You know, I think we lack, as Gordon was saying, a real depth of understanding about the value and the amazingness of the gospel. We get hints of it here, but sometimes we read over it too fast. I encourage you to stop and think, you know, what is it that people were willing to give up for this? And if they were willing to, what does that say about how valuable it is and how valuable we should see it? I'll leave you with that and a couple of questions. Questions for you and questions maybe to ask other people to carry this conversation on. Remember, we want to have gospel conversations. So I want you to think, and then, you know, bring it up. Sometimes these are not easy questions. You might be wondering, what am I going to lose if I ask this question? That's the whole point, right? Don't worry about it. What is worth suffering for? Probably not the question you expect on your coffee break, but hey, try it out. At the water cooler, ask someone, you know, this has been on my mind. What do you think about it? This is safe, just ask them for an opinion, but you might get to have a conversation. And then, you know, follow it up, because that's where it really gets down to the important details. Why is it worth suffering for? And, you know, maybe initially they'll talk about family. They'll talk about commitments to something like, you know, if it's someone at the fire or the rescue squad, you know, they'll talk about things that are worth suffering for, and you ask why. Why is that worthwhile? Is it because people are important? Is it because, you know, of reputation in the community, because I want a legacy, or where does it lead to? In the end, we have an opportunity in that to talk about the greater things and the greatest thing, the relationship we have with Christ. So, let's close there. Father, just ask that you would give us an appreciation of the very fact that you teach us to pray like that. That we have a welcome in your house. Because we're gonna watch videos this month, and we're gonna pray for people who have lost their house, given up their families, or even been kicked out of their families for that. But they knew it was worthwhile because you called them home. I pray that we would see how worthwhile the gospel is, and that it would grow in our esteem, and that it would grow in urgency, that talking about it and living out of it would be a joy and more important than any worldly sufferings that might